Welcome back everybody. Today we have a video of Helldivers 2 with a viewer question and setup. It's a PC setup. So this video is about the Ryzen 5 2600 and the Ryzen 5 1500X and 8GB of memory and the GTX 1070 Ti. The viewer in question is Dr. Philip, telling me that the Ryzen 5 2600 should be 40% more performing in this game, which I somehow disagree. It's about 10 to 12% difference between the two CPU, which I'll show you just in a moment. Then he said why I've used 8GB for the 2600, and that is when I noticed that my 2600, I think there's a memory channel dead on the CPU because I can put as much memory I want. This is the maximum it detects. So I browse the used market and get another Ryzen 5 2600 for this testing and future testing that I will need that CPU. And lastly, the GPU, the GTX 1070 Ti, which Dr. Philip have in his setup. So, welcome to Response PC, I'm Dunk, let's game on. We're going to do the test at 1080p, high settings, render native, and with the RTX 3060, the 12GB variant. I don't want the GPU to bottleneck our CPU in this testing, because we're going to check the Ryzen 5 1500X versus the Ryzen 5 2600. Just to point out the difference between the 1500X and the 2600 is the 1500X is a 4-core 8-thread and the 26 is a 6-core 12-thread. The 1500X is a 3.5 GHz and the 2600 is 3.4 GHz, a little 100 MHz towards the older CPU. So starting off with the 1500X, we have an average of 39 FPS with everything at a high, render at a balance, 1080p. The GPU have some breathing room, averaging 50% of utilization, so the GPU is not our bottleneck. For the CPU, we are averaging 86% of utilization. One of the core is maxed out at 100%. Quickly dropping the graphics settings to medium to give some strain to the CPU and even more headroom for the GPU. Doesn't change anything. The GPU is utilizing even less power and the CPU is averaging the same, 84, 85, 86% of utilization. The FPS climb a bit, often higher in the 50s, but that's it. Nothing to add on that. The RAM, we've barely reached 11GB of memory, so their 16GB is well enough. Now dropping in the Ryzen 5 2600s on the same map, on the same planet. Not exactly the same map, but what I can do, I cannot choose the map I'm going to fail on. So the closest I can get is the same planet and give us a rough idea of how it will fare. So the Ryzen 5 2600, high settings, render balance, at 1080p with the RTX 3060 12GB and 16GB of memory. We averaging a 37 FPS, really close to the 1500X, which was 2-3 FPS higher. The GPU utilization is even a bit lower this time at 48 instead of 50, not a big difference, but still in the margin of error because we're not exactly the same map. For the CPU, we are averaging a 78% of utilization instead of 86. It's really weird that the 1500X can somehow surpass the 2600 from game to game. Even the boost of the 2600 is 3.9 and the 1500X is at 3.7 GHz. And dropping the setting to medium give the little bit of edge to the 2600, averaging 42 FPS, if you can say this is in the margin of error, because we get 42 FPS instead of 39 with the 1500X. I would say even though the 2600 have more core and a boost higher than the 1500X, they're quite so similar that in the gameplay you won't see a difference at some point, or to some extent. So here's the result of both CPU. Let's say they're the same. Now for Dr. Philip setup, it's the Ryzen 5 2600, the GTX 1070 and 16GB of memory. If it were the GTX 1070 Ti, we will have a similar result as the RTX 3060, but it's the non-Ti variant. But here, as you can see, the GTX 1070 at the medium settings and 1080p and render at balance, we get a 50 to 60 GPU utilization. The CPU is at the 76 to 80 on the same planet and on a map that is quite similar to the 1500X test that we did. And we are averaging 37 to 39 FPS. It's quite well playable. By the way, the difficulty is at 5. I forgot to ask Dr. Philip what was the FPS you were getting with that setup. So if you can comment in the comment section and tell me what was the FPS you are getting. Is it similar to what I have or is it worse? We also need to take in consideration that I'm playing on a fresh Windows install without any junkware on it. It's only Windows, Steam, the game, MSI Afterburner, and the drivers. I also want to remind you, if you have a game that I already test and you have a specific hardware that you want me to test, just post it in the comments. If I have the hardware, I will test it for you and show you the FPSage that you should get. On that note, thanks for come watching and see you in the next one. And subscribe.